Picture a sloop cutting through the grey November water of Hampton Roads, Virginia. The year is 1718. The wind is sharp, carrying the smell of brine and something fouler. At the tip of the bowsprit, lashed with rope and tilting with each swell, hangs a human head. The beard is long, black, twisted into thick braids tied with dark ribbons. The eyes are half open. The mouth hangs slack, frozen somewhere between defiance and surprise. Every sailor in the harbour stops what he is doing. Every dockworker on the quay turns to stare. Every officer on the pier reaches for his spyglass. They all know whose head that is. His name was Edward Teach. The world called him Blackbeard. And the man who cut that head from its body, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, has just sailed it north from the Outer Banks of Carolina as proof that the most feared pirate in the American colonies is finally, undeniably dead. But here is the question that matters more than how he died. How much of what you think you know about Blackbeard was real, and how much was invented, 6 years after his death, by a writer whose own identity remains a mystery? If stories like this are why you are here, the real history behind the legends, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. What is the one thing you think you know about Blackbeard? Let us see how many of those facts survive the next 30 minutes. To understand Edward Teach, you have to understand the world that created him, because Blackbeard did not emerge from nowhere. He was manufactured by history. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the War of the Spanish Succession, a sprawling, bloody conflict that had consumed Europe, the Caribbean, and the American colonies for more than a decade. Britain, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, every major power had spent a generation feeding men and money into a war fought on land and sea, from Flanders to the Philippines. The treaty brought peace. It also brought catastrophe for thousands of men who had known nothing but war. Overnight, the Royal Navy contracted. Privateering commissions, the legal licenses that allowed civilian vessels to attack enemy shipping for profit, were revoked. Thousands of experienced sailors, gunners, carpenters, and navigators found themselves discharged into colonial ports with no pension, no employment prospects, and a very specific set of skills. They knew how to sail, how to fight, and how to take ships. At the same time, the Caribbean was an ocean of almost obscene opportunity for anyone willing to break the law. Merchant vessels loaded with sugar, tobacco, indigo, rum, and enslaved human beings crisscrossed poorly patrolled shipping lanes. Colonial governors were underfunded, understaffed, and in many cases openly corrupt. The Spanish treasure fleet still moved between Havana and Cadiz. The French sugar islands produced wealth that made European aristocrats nervous. And then there was Nassau. New Providence Island in the Bahamas had become, by 1716, the closest thing the pirate world ever produced to a capital city. The legitimate colonial government had effectively collapsed. The harbour was deep enough for careening ships, but shallow enough to strand pursuing warships. A rotating population of somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pirates operated from its beaches and taverns at any given time. Historians call it the Republic of Pirates, though it was less a republic and more a violent, alcohol-fueled anarchy with rules enforced by whoever had the most guns. Among the pirates who called Nassau home was a man named Benjamin Hornigold, an English privateer turned pirate who had been raiding Atlantic shipping since at least 1713. Hornigold was experienced, well-connected, and commanded significant respect among the Nassau pirates. He was also, by pirate standards, selective. He reportedly refused to attack English vessels, which limited his appeal to crews who preferred equal opportunity plunder. Sometime around 1716, Hornigold took on a new crew member, a tall, powerfully built man with a dark beard and, if the later sources are to be believed, an instinct for violence that would eventually consume everything around him. Here is what we actually know about Edward Teach before he became Blackbeard. Almost nothing. No birth certificate has ever been found, no baptismal record, no parish entry. The most commonly cited birthplace is Bristol, England, a major port city with deep historical ties to Atlantic trade, privateering, and the transatlantic slave trade. Some sources suggest he was born in Jamaica. Others propose London. His surname appears in contemporary documents as Teach, Thatch, Thasher, and Thash. 3 centuries of scholarship have failed to settle even the spelling of his name. The best historical inference, and it is inference, not certainty, is that Teach served as a privateer during Queen Anne's War, the American theatre of the War of the Spanish Succession. If so, he would have learned seamanship, gunnery, navigation, and close-quarters combat aboard licensed warships raiding French and Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. He would have been trained, essentially, as a professional maritime predator, and when the commissions expired, he simply continued the work without the paperwork. By 1716, he was sailing under Hornigold's command. By early 1717, Hornigold trusted him enough to give him independent command of a captured sloop. Teach proved effective. He took prizes. He attracted crew. He demonstrated a talent for the one thing that mattered most in piracy. Not violence, but the credible threat of violence. And then, in November 1717, Edward Teach did something that transformed him from one of dozens of minor Caribbean pirates into a figure of genuine naval consequence. He captured a French slave ship called La Concorde. La Concorde was a vessel with a history as brutal as the man who took her. Built in England, captured by the French, she had been converted into a slave ship operating out of Nantes, one of the principal ports of the French transatlantic slave trade. At roughly 200 tons and carrying 14 guns, she was a substantial vessel. In November 1717, she was on a transatlantic crossing carrying enslaved Africans toward Martinique when Teach intercepted her near the island of Saint Vincent. The capture was reportedly swift. La Concorde's crew had been ravaged by dysentery and scurvy during the crossing, a common and devastating consequence of the Middle Passage that killed crew and captives alike. Teach took the ship with minimal resistance, reportedly firing only a few warning shots before the French captain struck his colours. What Teach did next turned him from a competent pirate into a predator of an entirely different order. He renamed the vessel Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that was itself a political statement, referencing Queen Anne, who had died in August 1714. Whether this was genuine Jacobite sentiment, cynical branding, or simply a dramatic name is impossible to determine. But the effect was unmistakable. He armed her. Accounts vary. Some say 40 guns, others as many as 44. He added crew from captured vessels and from the eager volunteers who flocked to any pirate with a powerful ship. Queen Anne's Revenge was now a warship by any reasonable definition, heavier and more heavily armed than most Royal Navy vessels patrolling the American colonies. And Teach added something no amount of cannon could replicate: an image. Here is what separates Edward Teach from almost every other pirate of his era. He understood, instinctively or deliberately, that terror was more efficient than violence. The image is famous. You have seen it in paintings, in films, on 100 YouTube thumbnails. The tall figure on the quarterdeck, the long black beard, braided and ribboned, hanging almost to his chest, and woven into that beard, slow matches, lengths of hemp cord soaked in saltpeter and lime water, burning slowly, producing thin trails of acrid smoke that wreathed his face in a sulphurous haze. In the dim light of a ship's deck, at the moment of boarding, the effect would have been genuinely terrifying. A man whose face appeared to be on fire. That image comes primarily from one source, A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 under the name Captain Charles Johnson. We will return to that book later, because it is the single most important and most unreliable source in pirate history. But here is the detail that almost never appears in the legend. For all the terrifying imagery, Blackbeard's confirmed kill count before his final battle is remarkably low. Possibly 0 confirmed kills of captives or prisoners. The surviving historical record, trial depositions, Admiralty correspondence, colonial reports, suggests that Teach overwhelmingly preferred to terrify crews into surrender rather than fight them. Ships struck their colours when they saw his flag. Merchants handed over cargo without firing a shot. Prisoners were, by the general testimony available, treated with rough pragmatism rather than sadistic cruelty. Terror was not a personality trait, it was a business model, and it worked. There is one more figure worth pausing on before we reach the main event. Israel Hands, Teach's reputed first mate, captain of the sloop Adventure. According to Johnson's account, Teach once shot Hands in the knee during a drunken evening below decks, allegedly to remind the crew who was in charge. Hands survived, was captured at the Battle of Ocracoke, and later testified at the trial of Blackbeard's crew in Williamsburg. More than a century later, Robert Louis Stevenson borrowed his name for the treacherous coxswain in Treasure Island, one of many ways Blackbeard's crew drifted from history into fiction. The most dramatic demonstration of Teach's strategy of terror came in May 1718, when he did something no pirate had attempted before, and no pirate would attempt again. He blockaded Charleston, South Carolina. For roughly a week in late May 1718, Teach's small fleet, Queen Anne's Revenge, the sloop Adventure, and several smaller prizes, stationed themselves at the mouth of Charleston Harbor and seized every vessel that attempted to enter or leave. Charleston was one of the wealthiest ports in British North America. Teach was strangling it. He captured at least 8 or 9 ships. He took prominent hostages, including Samuel Wragg, a member of the South Carolina Council, and Wragg's young son. He sent a delegation ashore, pirates walking openly through the streets of a British colonial capital, to deliver his ransom demand. And the ransom he demanded was not gold, not silver, not jewels. He demanded a chest of medicine. For generations, historians debated what illness would drive a pirate to hold an entire city hostage for medical supplies rather than treasure. The answer came not from any written record, but from the ocean floor. When the wreck of Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered in 1996 off the coast of Beaufort, North Carolina, a research team from Nassau, Inc., later joined by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, recovered a remarkable collection of artifacts. Among them were medical instruments, a urethral syringe, a Clyster pump, fragments of apothecary jars, equipment entirely consistent with the treatment of syphilis, a disease that was, in the early 18th century, both devastatingly common among sailors and essentially untreatable without mercury-based compounds. The medicine chest demand suddenly made sense. The archaeology confirmed what the written record could only hint at. The most feared pirate in the Atlantic was almost certainly dealing with a disease that was slowly destroying him from the inside. Charleston paid the ransom. The medicine chest was delivered. Teach released his hostages, apparently unharmed, and sailed north, into betrayal. Weeks after the Charleston blockade, in June 1718, something happened that historians still debate. Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground at Topsail Inlet, now known as Beaufort Inlet, on the coast of North Carolina. The sloop Adventure's tender also grounded. Roughly 25 men were stranded on a sandbar with minimal supplies, and Teach, with a much smaller crew and a smaller vessel, sailed away with the accumulated plunder. Accident? Almost certainly not. The evidence, circumstantial but compelling, suggests Teach deliberately wrecked his own flagship. The reasoning is coldly mathematical. He had been sailing with a large and growing crew. More pirates meant more shares of any plunder. By grounding the larger vessels and stranding a significant portion of his men, Teach could consolidate the accumulated wealth among a much smaller group, primarily himself. Among those left behind, in a sense, was Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, a Barbados plantation owner turned pirate who had been sailing in loose association with Teach. Bonnet had been conveniently sent ashore at the time of the grounding. When he returned, Teach was gone. Bonnet would later be captured, tried, and hanged in Charleston in December 1718, an ironic end for a man whose brief pirate career had been almost entirely overshadowed by Teach's. What Teach did next was equally calculated. He sailed to Bathtown, North Carolina, and presented himself to Governor Charles Eden. He accepted the king's pardon, part of King George III's general amnesty of 1718, officially known as the Act of Grace, which offered a clean slate to any pirate who surrendered by a specified date. Teach surrendered. He married a local woman, reportedly his 14th wife, though this number originates with Johnson and should be treated with extreme skepticism. He settled into what appeared, from the outside, like respectable colonial life. From the inside, it was anything but. Governor Eden was almost certainly complicit in Teach's continuing piratical operations. Tobias Knight, Eden's secretary and the colony's chief justice, was later found to have received stolen goods from Teach, including sugar and cocoa from a captured French vessel that Teach fraudulently claimed to have found as an abandoned derelict. The arrangement was straightforward. Eden provided legal cover and political protection, and Teach provided a share of the profits. But this arrangement had one critical vulnerability. It depended on the other colonial governors looking the other way. And the governor of Virginia was not a man inclined to look away. Alexander Spotswood, the lieutenant governor of Virginia, despised Blackbeard and feared him. Reports had reached Spotswood that Teach was operating near the Virginia coastline. Rumors circulated that he was planning to fortify Ocracoke Inlet as a permanent pirate stronghold. Whether those rumors were accurate or not, Spotswood decided to act. What he did was legally questionable at best. Blackbeard was in North Carolina waters, operating under the protection of a North Carolina governor, having accepted a lawful royal pardon. Spotswood had no jurisdiction in another colony. He did not consult Governor Eden. He did not seek approval from London. He simply decided that Blackbeard was a threat, and he marshaled the resources to eliminate him. His motivations were likely a mixture of genuine security concern and political calculation. Eliminating Blackbeard would burnish Spotswood's reputation in London. It would weaken Eden, a political rival, and it would remove a genuinely dangerous presence from waters uncomfortably close to Virginia's coastline. In November 1718, Spotswood organized two expeditions. An overland force under Captain Ellis Brand marched south toward Bathtown to arrest Teach's associates and seize any plunder held ashore. A naval force, two hired sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, crewed by sailors drawn from HMS Pearl and HMS Lyme, sailed south under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard. Their orders were unambiguous: find Blackbeard, kill or capture him. Maynard was given no cannons. The sloops were shallow draft vessels, fast, maneuverable in the tidal channels of Pamlico Sound, but armed with nothing heavier than muskets, pistols, and cutlasses. Roughly 60 men between the two boats. Against Teach, his sloop Adventure, approximately 19 to 25 crew, and 8 or 9 mounted guns. On paper, Maynard was outgunned. In practice, he had a plan, and he had one advantage Teach did not expect: men hidden below decks. The night of November 21st, 1718. Ocracoke Inlet, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Shallow water, sandbars shifting with every tide, channels barely wide enough for a sloop's keel. Maynard's two vessels anchor just outside the inlet and wait for dawn. Aboard the Adventure, Blackbeard is reportedly spending the evening drinking with a local trader named Samuel Odell. According to trial testimony given later by members of Teach's surviving crew, someone asked Teach whether his wife knew where he had hidden his treasure. His alleged reply, that only he and the devil knew where the treasure lay, and the longest liver should take it all, is one of the most quoted lines in pirate history. It almost certainly never happened. The source is Johnson, writing 6 years after the fact, and the line reads like a novelist's invention, not the offhand remark of a drunk sailor in a shallow water anchorage. Dawn, November 22nd. Maynard's sloops enter the channel. The water is treacherous: sand, shoals, unpredictable currents. Navigation in Pamlico Sound was dangerous even for experienced local pilots. Maynard was sailing blind, feeling his way through channels he had never seen. Blackbeard sees them coming. What happens next unfolds in minutes that would echo for centuries. Teach opens fire. The Adventure's guns, loaded with swan shot, nails, langrage, and scrap iron, rake both sloops at close range. The Ranger takes the worst of it. Her commander, Midshipman Hyde, some sources say Baker, is wounded. Several men are killed instantly. Others are maimed by the improvised shrapnel. The Ranger falls out of the fight, drifting and crippled, her rigging shredded. Maynard is alone. He orders his remaining men below decks, all of them. The Jane's deck is suddenly, conspicuously empty, strewn with the dead and dying, but with no visible living defenders. It looks, from the Adventure's rail, like a ship that has already lost. It is a trap, and Blackbeard walks directly into it. Teach brings the Adventure alongside the Jane. His crew throws improvised grenades, glass bottles packed with shot, iron scraps, and gunpowder fitted with burning fuses. The devices explode across the deck in a chaos of smoke, noise, and flying metal. Then Teach himself leads his men over the gunwale and onto the Jane, and Maynard's men explode from below. The fighting is point blank. Cutlasses at arm's length, pistols fired into faces, knives, fists. In the smoke and the blood and the screaming, Maynard and Teach find each other. Both men fire pistols. Maynard's shot hits Teach. Where exactly? The accounts do not agree. They draw swords. According to multiple sources, their blades lock, and Teach's heavy cutlass snaps Maynard's sword blade clean off at the hilt. Maynard steps back. Teach raises his cutlass for the killing blow, and then, from behind, a sailor, or possibly a Highland soldier from the Ranger's crew who had managed to re-enter the fight, steps in and slashes Teach across the throat. Blackbeard does not fall. He fights on, blood sheeting from his neck, from pistol wounds, from lacerations opening across his body with every passing second. He keeps swinging. He cocks another pistol. He is still fighting, still standing, still attacking, when his body finally does what his will refuses to do. He collapses. Mid-motion, the pistol half raised. Edward Teach is dead. The body count, as later reported, 5 pistol ball wounds, 20 cutlass lacerations, a throat wound that very nearly severed his head entirely. That enumeration, 5 pistol balls and 20 cutlass wounds, comes from Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724. It has been repeated in every Blackbeard biography, every documentary, and every encyclopedia article for 300 years. And it may be entirely invented. Johnson was not present at the battle. His source, or sources, for the wound count are unknown. Lieutenant Maynard's own letter to the Admiralty, the only confirmed first-hand account from the British side, describes the battle in general terms but does not enumerate the wounds with anything approaching Johnson's theatrical specificity. What Johnson produced was not a medical examiner's report. It was a resurrection myth. The unkillable demon, the pirate who would not die, the monster who kept fighting long past the point at which any human body should have failed. It is a magnificent piece of storytelling, and it may be entirely fiction. Maynard's men cut Teach's head from his body. They threw the corpse overboard. The head was lashed to the bowsprit of the Jane, the same bowsprit we saw at the opening of this story, sailing into Hampton Roads. The legend, unverifiable, irresistible, and almost certainly apocryphal, says that Blackbeard's headless body, thrown into the water of Ocracoke Inlet, swam 3 full circles around the sloop before sinking beneath the surface. It did not happen. But the fact that the story was circulating within months of his death tells you everything you need to know about the machinery of myth. Blackbeard was being transformed from a man into a monster before his blood had dried on Maynard's deck. Teach was dead, but the aftermath of Ocracoke extended far beyond his severed head. Captain Ellis Brand's overland expedition reached Bathtown shortly after the battle. His men seized goods that Blackbeard had stored ashore and raided Tobias Knight's barn, confiscating sugar, cocoa, and cotton that had been taken from the captured French vessel. The seized goods were later auctioned in Virginia for approximately £2,238, money that Governor Spotswood used to fund the expedition and pay the bounty he had offered for Blackbeard's head. 16 surviving members of Blackbeard's crew were taken in chains to Williamsburg, Virginia, where they were held in the public jail for more than 3 months awaiting trial. The trial took place in March 1719. The verdict was swift and predictable. All were found guilty of piracy except 2. Samuel Odell was acquitted on the grounds that he had been aboard the Adventure for only a single day. Israel Hands, Teach's former first mate, the same man Teach had allegedly shot in the knee, was pardoned, reportedly in exchange for his testimony against Tobias Knight and others. The remaining 13 or 14 convicted pirates were hanged along Capitol Landing Road in Williamsburg. Their bodies were displayed in gibbets at the roadside, iron cages designed to hold a corpse upright as it rotted, visible to every traveller entering or leaving the colonial capital. The message was unsubtle. This is what happens to pirates. As for Israel Hands, the man whose name Robert Louis Stevenson would later borrow for Treasure Island, the historical record suggests he drifted into obscurity. Some accounts place him as a beggar on the streets of London years later, though this cannot be confirmed. The political fallout was equally dramatic. Governor Eden, furious at what he considered an illegal invasion of North Carolina's sovereign territory, demanded the return of the seized goods. Spotswood refused. Eden's camp argued, with considerable legal justification, that the entire operation had been conducted without jurisdiction, without authorization from London, and in violation of another colony's sovereignty. Spotswood countered by accusing Eden of complicity with pirates, appealing directly to Lord Carteret and claiming the king's implicit authority. Tobias Knight was formally accused of accessory to piracy. His trial was held in March 1719 at the home of Frederick Jones, with Governor Eden and the governing council presiding. Knight, reportedly frail and near death, conducted his own defense with considerable skill, arguing that his correspondence with Teach predated the pirates' return to illegal activity, and that the testimony of pirates and enslaved persons should not be admitted under English law. Eden and the council acquitted him. Knight nonetheless resigned as Chief Justice shortly afterward. He died before any further investigation could be launched. Eden himself was never formally charged. Edward Moseley, a prominent North Carolinian, publicly accused the governor of profiting from Blackbeard's crimes in 1719, and was arrested and fined for his trouble. Eden's reputation suffered, but he retained his office. He died of yellow fever on March 26, 1722, at Eden House, his plantation in Bertie County. The town of Queen Anne's Creek, near his home, was subsequently renamed Edenton in his honour. The question of whether he was Blackbeard's silent partner or simply an ineffective governor remains unresolved to this day. Spotswood's own fate carried its own irony. He was replaced as Lieutenant Governor of Virginia in September 1722, though historians attribute his removal primarily to years of accumulated political opposition from the House of Burgesses and the Governor's Council, particularly from powerful figures like William Byrd and the Reverend James Blair, rather than to the Blackbeard operation specifically. He remained in Virginia, built ironworks, acquired vast landholdings, and eventually served as Deputy Postmaster General for British North America. He died in Annapolis in 1740, aged 63. The man who had crossed colonial boundaries and bent the law to kill a pirate ended his days as a respectable Virginia planter, a transformation that Blackbeard himself might have appreciated. The head was displayed on a stake at the entrance to the Hampton River in Virginia, a point that came to be known as Blackbeard's Point. There it remained, rotting, eyeless, blackening in the sun, as a warning to every sailor who passed. Later accounts, impossible to verify but endlessly repeated, claim the skull was eventually silver-plated and used as a drinking cup. A tavern in Virginia allegedly displayed it into the 19th century. Whether any of this is true is anyone's guess. The skull's current whereabouts, if it still exists, are unknown. But the real engine of Blackbeard's immortality was not the head on the stake. It was a book, a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates, published in London in 1724 under the name Captain Charles Johnson, is the single most influential work ever written about piracy. Almost everything the general public believes about Golden Age pirates, their codes, their personalities, their flags, their final words, traces back, directly or indirectly, to this one book. And we do not know who wrote it. For decades, literary scholars attributed the work to Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders. The argument rested on stylistic analysis and circumstantial evidence. More recent scholarship, particularly the work of historians like Arne Bialuszewski, has largely dismantled the Defoe attribution, but no one has conclusively identified the real author. Captain Charles Johnson may be a pseudonym. He may be a real person whose other records have been lost. He may be a composite. The author of the most important pirate book in history is himself a ghost. This matters enormously because Johnson's account of Blackbeard, the fusees in the beard, the 14 wives, the treasure quote at Ocracoke, the 5 pistol balls and 20 cutlass wounds, has been treated as historical fact for 3 centuries. But Johnson was writing 6 years after Teach's death, from sources we cannot identify, with literary and commercial motivations that clearly favoured spectacle over precision. His Blackbeard is not a historical portrait. It is a character, as carefully constructed, as deliberately terrifying, and as commercially motivated as any figure in the novels of the era. Strip away what Johnson wrote. Set aside the dramatizations. Rely only on the primary sources, Maynard's letter, Spotswood's correspondence, the trial depositions, the Boston newsletter reports, and the portrait that emerges is dramatically different. The documented Blackbeard was a pirate who operated for roughly 2 years, who commanded his most powerful ship for roughly 6 months before deliberately wrecking it, who blockaded one city, captured perhaps 24 vessels, and killed, before his final battle, possibly no one at all. The monster who would not die was, by the professional standards of his own era, a remarkably efficient minimalist. He built a brand, he projected terror, and when the brand stopped working, he died in a shallow inlet in North Carolina, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and killed by men who, legally, should not have been there. Blackbeard's afterlife has been as prolific as his actual career was brief. Stevenson's debt to Johnson is direct and acknowledged. Not only Israel Handsworth's name, but the very architecture of Treasure Island draws from the raw material Johnson had provided a century and a half earlier: the buried treasure, the black spot, the one-legged sea cook. All of it filtered through Johnson's dramatized accounts of Golden Age piracy. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Blackbeard has appeared in more films, television series, and video games than any other historical pirate. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise gave him Ian McShane's Cold Menace. Assassin's Creed 4 placed him in a digital Caribbean. Every iteration borrows the same visual language: the burning beard, the bandolier of pistols, the towering physical presence. Because Johnson's description was so vivid, so theatrical, and so perfectly engineered for visual storytelling that no one has ever improved on it. The irony is inescapable. The man who built terror as a brand, who understood, perhaps better than any pirate of his generation, that the story is the weapon, has been consumed by his own narrative. The real Edward Teach, whoever he was, vanished the moment Johnson's book went to press. What remains is the character, the demon in the smoke, the monster who would not die, the severed head on the bowsprit. In 1996, a research team from Nassau, Inc. discovered the wreck of a large vessel in shallow water off Beaufort Jaw, North Carolina. The site, designated 31 CR 34T, was gradually excavated over the following decades by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. In 2011, after years of analysis, state authorities formally confirmed the wreck as Queen Anne's Revenge. The artifacts tell a story that supplements, and in certain respects, corrects, the written record. At least 31 cannons have been recovered, ranging from small swivel guns to 6-pounders, some bearing Swedish foundry marks dated 1713, others with English proof marks. Over 400,000 artifacts have been catalogued. Anchors, ballast stones, gold dust, lead shot, glass trade beads, pewter tableware, navigational instruments, human bone fragments, and the medical equipment already described. French-manufactured weapons and hardware are consistent with the ship's origin as La Concorde. The sheer volume of ordnance confirms that Queen Anne's Revenge was, as the written sources claim, very heavily armed for a vessel of her size. The wreck tells us that the ship was real, that it was formidably armed, that the crew dealt with disease, that they carried instruments of both war and medicine. What it cannot tell us, what no shipwreck ever can, is who Edward Teach actually was. On certain nights, the people of Ocracoke Island will tell you about a light. It moves across the water near the inlet, low, flickering, directionless, appearing and vanishing without pattern or explanation. The locals have called it Teacher's Light for as long as anyone can remember. The skeptical explanation is phosphorescent algae, or the refraction of distant boat lanterns, or the way moonlight fractures on shallow tidal water stirred by wind. The other explanation is the one that has persisted for 300 years, that Edward Teach's headless body still searches the shallows of Ocracoke Inlet for its missing head. You can believe that or not. It does not matter. What matters is this: a man whose real name we cannot confirm, whose birthplace we cannot verify, whose entire piratical career lasted barely 2 years, and whose most powerful ship survived barely 6 months, became, through the deliberate machinery of his own terror, through the literary invention of an unidentified author, and through 3 centuries of compounding myth, the most famous pirate who ever lived. He was not the most successful. Henry. Every took a single Mughal prize worth more than everything Teach captured in his entire career. He was not the most prolific. Bartholomew Roberts captured over 400 vessels across a career that dwarfed Teach's. He was not the most brutal. Edward Lowe tortured captives in ways that make Teach's reputation look restrained. But none of them have his name. None of them have his face. None of them burn in the popular imagination the way Blackbeard does, because none of them understood, the way Edward Teach understood, that the story is the weapon. He built the monster. An unknown writer perfected it. And 300 years later, on the dark water off Ocracoke, the light still moves.